What's up, outliers? Welcome to Performance Bites for bite-sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. Today, we're going to be looking into carbohydrates and sugars. So sometimes getting a bad rap because we hear that overconsumption of carbohydrate can cause health issues and such things like that, which has a lot of validity. But we're going to look at it from more of a performance place because for the sake of performance, carbohydrates are very, very important. But at the same time, not every carbohydrate is created the same. So we'll kind of dive into the differences of different types of sugars, different types of carbohydrates, and how they process and work in the body and how exercise affects them as well. So first thing about carbohydrate is a macronutrient. So we have three macronutrients: our fats, our carbs, and our proteins. Protein, we hear a lot of positives about. Meanwhile, when it comes to fat and carbohydrate, we can hear some demonization around the types and all this stuff like that. So we're going to only really look at the positive things around carbohydrates and talk about the good types that are actually going to be beneficial and aid you in performance. So an important thing to talk about when we get into carbohydrate as well is glycemic index, which glycemic index is essentially how a carbohydrate affects your blood sugar. And so it's kind of on a scale from 0 to 100, but there are things that go above the 100. But just to keep it simple, we're going to look at it from a 0 to 100. Fruit can vary in this 0 to 100 quite significantly. Things like blueberries tend to sit more around 30-ish on the glycemic index. Meanwhile, things like pineapple, mango, some of the other fruits might be a little bit higher, 70, maybe even 80. So we look at those two things and we go, okay, one's going to affect my blood sugar a little bit greater. So if I'm going to consume a high glycemic index sugar, it's likely I'm going to be better off using that right before a workout or even during a workout to fuel myself. Because if we send if we send sugar into the blood, the cells will want to utilize it for energy sources. Meanwhile, if we're having that exact same piece of fruit with a high glycemic index and we're not really doing anything, we're not really moving, it's still going to be sent into the blood. However, the body is going to release insulin, which is a hormone, to actually go grab that sugar out of the blood, and we're going to store it for later, typically in fat cells. Now, the reason why the body does that is because evolutionarily speaking, having carbohydrate is a wonderful fuel source, and we didn't always have grocery stores on every corner. So the body goes, hey, that's still good fuel. We're just going to store it for later rather than use it right now, which you can see if you have too much of it over a long period of time, that storage is going to start to build, which is a wonderful thing. So that's kind of the big thing with that glycemic index, because if I have like a blueberry, that lower glycemic index fruit, and I'm just hanging out, I'm not going to spike blood sugar nearly as much, which then will cause less insulin, less storage, stuff like that. So understanding the glycemic index for carbohydrate is fairly important and can be a big helper when deciding how to pick your carbohydrates. All this stuff is available, very easy to find the glycemic index of these foods. So nothing too crazy here. Take a minute and acknowledge our sponsor today, which is Intake Breathing. So Intake Breathing makes nasal dilators, which is awesome for enhancing nasal breathing. So if you watched or listened to the Performance Bite on mouth breathing versus nasal breathing, you would know that nasal breathing is the optimal passage for oxygen to get into the system and to be utilized by the cells. So this tool being attached to my nose through tabs and then the nasal dilator having magnets on it actually will open up and enhance my nasal breathing, which is great for sleep, great for performance, great for all things like that. So, I couldn't recommend it more. It's something that I've used for probably about 7 years now, and I'm super stoked to have them as a sponsor for Outlier. So go check out intakebreathing.com and get yourself set up with a starter kit. So like I said, Carbohydrate is a macronutrient. So macronutrients have caloric value to them. So carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram, which is the exact same as protein that has 4 calories per gram. Meanwhile, fat has 9 calories per gram. The big difference between protein and carbohydrate, though both yielding the 4 calories per gram, is their thermal effect of food. So the thermal effect of food is essentially how your body is going to utilize what you just put in to also use energy to digest it, because nothing is free in the body. So when we have protein, the example I always use is if I have 100 calories of protein, I'm going to lose roughly 30 calories due to digestion, which is great for the sake of metabolism, which is why protein is known as one of those things that we eat protein. It actually helps with our metabolism. So we are going to kind of lose some of that protein in the process because it just costs more to digest it. Meanwhile, a carbohydrate is anywhere from 5 to 10 calories per 100. So a 5 to 10% loss. So if we have 100 calories of carbohydrate, we're going to use about 5 to 10 of those calories to digest it, which is why carbohydrate is such a good fuel source, is because we're actually going to keep a lot of it and be able to use it. So let's look at the different types of carbohydrates now. So we have our monosaccharides, our disaccharides, and polysaccharides, which essentially is single chain, 2-chain, multi-chain. So certain things like glucose, fructose, and galactose are going to be our monosaccharides. Our disaccharides are our sucrose, and also our lactose, which is lactose is a combination of glucose and galactose. Meanwhile, sucrose is a glucose-fructose combination. Then polysaccharides are things like starches, glycogen, which is muscle storage, which we'll get to, and then fiber. Now, going back, mentioning the starches, resistant starch is a awesome thing, going back to that glycemic index. So certain things like rice, potatoes, oats can turn into resistant starch and lower the glycemic index through cooking, cooling, and reheating process. Won't get too much into that, but it does reduce the glycemic index by about 70%, which is quite significant for those foods. Fiber, we won't go too much into depth on fiber, but it is important to touch on soluble and insoluble fibers. So soluble fiber, soluble to water, insoluble, not soluble to water. So we get those through whole foods, and they digest slightly different because one's going to turn more into like a jelly, which is the soluble, and that kind of is like a lubrication for our digestive system. Meanwhile, the insoluble is kind of like a brush that can help clean us out a little bit. Both are important, but when I was back in college, we were taught like X amount per this age of a male or female, da-da-da-da-da. But as I've become a professional in this field myself, something that I think is just a good note is, as long as you're eating whole foods, fruits, vegetables, all that good stuff, don't worry too much about your fiber intake, because if you're having those, you're likely getting enough. Now, if there's issues with that, I'm not the person to talk to. Go speak to your professional doctor on that end. But having mentioned these different types of sugars, obviously different foods provide different sugars, but at the same time, the body wants all these things to be converted to glucose so that it can be used in glycolysis, which we'll get to in a second. So what's essentially happening is when we take in things like fructose, it's going to go into the liver and be digested down through fructose kinase, which is an enzyme essentially that's going to help turn that fructose into glucose. Same with all the other sugars and stuff. There's essentially enzymes and pathways that exist to convert them over. So the body gets the simple form of the glucose, which is this 6-carbon molecule. Actually has 12 hydrogen and 6 oxygen, which is a 1-to-1 ratio, which is quite nice because when those hydrogens and oxygens come in, they just get split off and get utilized differently. A lot of time, hydrogen will just attach to the oxygen and become water. So when we look at things from the perspective of energy intake, we need to understand how this energy is being used. So I mentioned the word glycolysis. Glycolysis, when broken down, glycolysis. Okay, so glyco is glucose, lysis is cutting. So it is the cutting of glucose. So 6 carbon molecule, we cut that in half. That's going to become something new. Then we keep on cutting it down, and we are basically going to process it for ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is our energy currency. So there's 2 main ways that glycolysis works: aerobic, anaerobic. Presence of oxygen, no oxygen. So when we're exercising and we're in a 60, 65, 75, 80, depending upon the person, we're going to start we're going to start utilizing carbohydrate and stop utilizing fat oxidation. So fat oxidation for energy is wonderful because it yields a big outcome of over 100 ATP, which is quite a lot, but it's actually a pretty long and slow process to do that. So as I sit here, I'm utilizing fat like that, but I'm producing a lot of ATP, which is great for energy. But if I increase my heart rate, I start to exceed a certain level. More conditioned individuals can go into a higher heart rate before they start to utilize carbohydrate. That's a adaptation that comes from training. An undertrained individual is going to start to convert earlier. So when you first start to get into glycolysis, you're likely going to have oxygen still present, and this is your aerobic glycolysis. So 6 carbon molecule glycolysis, we cut it in half. We have 3 carbon molecules of pyruvate. That gets cut down into acetyl-CoA. Now, this goes and gets thrown into something that's called the Krebs cycle. This has a lot of other processes, so we're just going to kind of skip over it. But what this will do is essentially yield 32 to 36 ATP, which is not as much as the fat oxidation, but it is a pretty good amount to continue with our exercise and our bout of, sport activity or whatever it is. So it's less than half, so that's not great, but it is faster in its process than it is the fat oxidation. Byproducts are essentially CO2 and water. So pretty good. We can actually hang out in there for quite some time as long as we have the carbohydrates present in the system to be utilized, which that gets into the fueling and having carbohydrates prior to exercise, and also having sugars stored in our muscle, which is glycogen. So we store a ton of glycogen in our muscles. The more muscles we have, the more storage we get, which is wonderful. We do store some in the liver, because inside the glycogen, we can have roughly 300 to 500 grams stored, which is quite a lot. We multiply that by 1,200 to 2,000 calories. But for long endurance bouts, you can get through those calories. It's quite impressive. And you don't want to rely fully on what we have stored, because you can get into a bad place with that. So it's better to actually have some replenishment to keep yourself at a balance rather than just relying on what you have stored, of course. We do run low on it, which is why within exercise, it is appropriate to replenish with carbohydrate. Everyone is going to be slightly different, but roughly 30 grams to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour is a general recommendation, depending upon the magnitude of the exercise. So there is nuance to like how intense the exercise is, and that will kind of determine your replenishment or just how your body metabolizes carbohydrate, because everyone's going to be different. If we go back to glycolysis now, we talked about the aerobic glycolysis and all of the energy sources and breakdown. So now we can look at anaerobic glycolysis, which is when we get into a state of exercise that is more intense and oxygen is no longer present to break down sugar. So we're now going to still split the 6 carbon molecule of the glucose in half into pyruvate, but rather than going and breaking it down further into the Krebs cycle, there's going to be a hydrogen that will attach to it and create lactate, which is a common byproduct that a lot of people hear about. Lactate, not lactic acid. Those are different. That's a pet peeve. So lactate now has the hydrogen attached to it. When it goes and gets circulated through the body into the liver is capable of breaking that off through a cycle called the Cori cycle. So that hydrogen goes away, likely will attach to oxygens and create H2O. and that will go elsewhere. But now we have pyruvates again. We just have free-floating pyruvates. So if one pyruvate, a 3-carbon molecule, attaches to another pyruvate, another 3-carbon molecule, we get a glucose of another 6-carbon molecule. So quite a cool way to actually recycle energy through that. It's still not going to be as long-lasting because we're not really yielding the ATP, which is super important, but we're at least still using energy, which in a pinch can work. According to the NSCA, there's certain recommendations for carbohydrate intake depending upon the athlete. So for an endurance athlete, it's going to be 5 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. So if you need to convert your body weight to kilograms, just divide it by 2.2. Pretty easy. That's for endurance athletes. Now, strength athletes, 3 to 5 grams per kilogram per day. Meanwhile, post-exercise, if you need to increase glycogen resynthesis, 1.2 per kilogram per day. These are just recommendations through the NSCA. Still play with it. It's really important because, I mean, like for endurance athletes, like 5 to 10 grams, that's, either 50% of what you should have or 200% of what you shouldn't have. So you need to play with that quite a bit and figure out what's going to work best for you, what's going to best work for your digestion, what's going to make you feel the best. It's not all just super cut and dry. Trial and error is really important because everyone's so unique, especially in their physiology, how their body utilizes things, their hormones, the muscle mass, the type of muscle, the slow twitch, the fast twitch, a lot of factors. So it's definitely, I always recommend to do some trial and error, play with it, test it within your training, not within your competition. You need to test these things in training so that you know what to do in competition. Stripping that back a little bit more, we hear a lot about carb loading and things like that. So essentially, it's the idea behind that is to increase your carbohydrate intake 2 to 3 days prior to usually like a marathon or something like that. That's like the common thing. This does hold validity, but at the same time, if you're training hard for your marathon or something of the sort, you're likely needing to take in carbohydrates for your training already. So I'm not a big advocate for large carbohydrate loading or carb loading before big events. I do believe that you need to make sure that you're getting adequate carbohydrate just to replenish your body and make sure it's there. But at the same time, like I said, figure it out in your training. Don't figure it out right before a competition. Don't be running for 10 weeks, getting ready for a marathon and not having experimented appropriately with your fueling, with your carbohydrates, electrolytes, hydration, all that sort of stuff, and waiting until race weekend to do so. I can almost guarantee you that's not going to go over wonderfully if you do it like that. So that's the breakdown of carbohydrate. Lots of information there just because it's fairly complex. Like I said, we're going over this as a place of performance, not as necessarily like a huge health thing. We're looking at it from performance because there are a lot of things around carbohydrates and health and stuff like that. We're not getting into that. We're talking about training. We're talking about performance. Okay. So thank you for watching or listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, rate, all that good stuff. It really helps grow the page, grows Outlier, and really helps with continuing to create these when we know that people are supporting us. So thank you so much for watching. And I'll catch you in the next one.